nobody was doing it really, and for Vietnam veterans in particular, they were really, the nation really had a hard time separating how it felt about the war from how it felt about those who fought the war. So, talk about forgiveness, I mean, that was a big deal. And we felt like, you know, as I was a combat infantryman myself, and we all certainly didn't feel like heroes, and we didn't really want a big parade. We didn't really want John Wayne to ordain us or anything. But we knew we were like suffering. I mean, among ourselves, I mean, we were just living such self-destructive lives. We were having a hard time getting work. A lot of us had issues around, you know, stress, and et cetera, and probably more of us were in jail than were in school. So there was a lot of problems, and so SWORD started on that basis that we got to be out there and we got to sort of help ourselves because nobody else is really stepping up here. So that's how we started, and we sort of grew from that. And we have these programs. We have like these drop-in programs, and you talk about forgiveness. I mean, when you're in poverty, you don't feel so great. You feel like you're not worth it, and so poverty itself requires forgiveness. So essentially, that's what we've done. We've tried to sort of eradicate poverty and suffering. And war does that. War causes suffering that lasts beyond the battlefield. And it causes a lot of poverty, too. A lot of poverty. And homelessness, and you name it. So we have this drop-in program. We've always had like a drop-in program for veterans, just freely to come in. And we help them. We make sure we send for their records, and we verify they're a veteran. And we treat them with the dignity and respect they deserve. Boom, that seems obvious, right? And we've always been in places where there are other veterans. We've always been in the community. I mean, why would you not want to be where the folks you're dealing with are, right? You don't want to be somewhere. So we've always been in San Francisco and in the Tenderloin, etc. So we've had disability vets come in, and we just try to help them. What are your needs? How do you get off the street? What's the suffering? What's going to go on? That kind of stuff. And then we recognized that a lot of veterans, especially after the Vietnam War, had what we call less than honorable discharges. Not a lot, but there were like 500,000 veterans after the Vietnam War that had what's called bad paper, another honorable discharge, which really got in the way of them getting, well, they couldn't get care, and two, they couldn't get any benefits from the VA, and it acted like a barrier to get a job. So we started helping veterans with less than honorable discharges, and veterans who were having trouble getting their claims with the VA, which was a whole other story, because you had this Veterans Administration that was not really set up for, I'm sorry to talk about history about the Vietnam War, but I think there's so many good lessons learned about how we treated Vietnam veterans that carry over today. So we had this, you know, institution, right, that created the middle class in our society after World War II, and there was a GI Bill, right, and it literally created the middle class. And so, but for Vietnam veterans, we didn't get the good GI Bill. We got sort of a watered down version. And we were, you know, just we didn't have the benefits and services that we really need. So if you had other honorable discharge, you couldn't even get that. And if you had an illness or an injury and it affected your ability to work, then you needed to get compensated. But you couldn't hire an attorney because there was a $10 attorney fee limitation if you want to hire an attorney to help you with your claim. And the VA bureaucracy is extensive. You know, you can't just file it and you'll get it the next day. And so we decided to sort of help veterans, you know, work with, that's how I started SWORDS in 1976. I was in law school. I started helping my fellow veterans apply for claims. And there was no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder. They didn't even recognize that. They called it anxiety, shell shock. There was no term for it. So no term for what we were suffering. We knew we were suffering. Guys were, like I said, they were very self-destructive lives. So we started, like I said, have a drop-in program and tried to help vets with legal claims and if they had bad paper. We had an incarcerated vet project because so many of us were in the joint, so we actually did outreach in the jails. We did all this with very limited money, but it was at that time, in 1976, 1977, there was far more support from the federal government to the urban areas than there is today. Far more. In 1980, we did a lot of jobs, so we had a job program as well. So just give you a comparison, 1980s, the city of San Francisco in 1980 received $50 million from the Department of Labor to help individuals with barriers to employment. Today, the city of San Francisco gets $6.1 million, right? And there's practically no employment services anywhere. There's not even a system of care out there. It's all been sort of hollowed out. So we were fortunate when we got started. We were in the 1970s. There was actually, there was a system of care out there. Now there isn't. And so we're really worried about what's going to happen to this new generation of younger veterans who are, when you come back from war, you need a lot of things, including forgiveness. And I will say one thing that's of note is that society has learned to separate its feelings about the war from its feelings about those who fight the war. So they don't have to carry that burden. But there's still like 1% of the population have to suffer and go to war, or in war, right? 1% of the population are subjected to war. And hardly any of our political leaders are in war, or their families, or their communities. So it's going to be a struggle. So we really determined to make sure that this new generation will not have to suffer the Vietnam veterans suffered. And so that's sort of what has sort of kept us going. In the mid-'80s, we learned about homelessness. Who can imagine there'd be homelessness in the great United States of America? That happens in like third world countries, I mean, when I was in Vietnam, the one thing that really struck me up was the extent of poverty in that country, which is, extraordinary poverty, in a developing country. And I was, I knew nothing. I was in Reading, Pennsylvania. I didn't know anything. But to be up close to that kind of poverty where, there was no decent sewage treatment. There was just towns and cities. It was just poor housing, no ventilation, just terrible, terrible conditions, right? And yet here today in America, right? We have homelessness, and we have conditions like those in developing countries. How could we allow that to happen? Isn't that amazing? So here we are today, and so in the mid-'80s we said, this is outrageous. The veterans were such a high percentage of those who were homeless. Over a third of the homeless was served in the military, which for those of us who were in Vietnam, it was not a shock at all. I mean, it was not a shock at all. We knew, we were like, we were on the misery index, committing suicide, living self-destructive lives, homelessness, it was just there was this whole period of neglect. So I just say that because I think this idea of like recognizing veterans and veterans themselves forgiving themselves so they can get on with their lives, and that's really an important part of it. I know a lot of Vietnam vets who actually went back to Vietnam, and it's been a very healing experience. Because, your image of Vietnam is, when you go back, it was a battlefield, there was, the Ashall Valley or something, or it was, you were in a situation where terrible things were happening. And then you go back and you see a society that's like, getting on with their lives, and they're mostly young people anyway in Vietnam, a tremendous number of young people. And that has done something for Vietnam veterans I know who have had lots of trauma, lots of nightmares, lots of pain. They went to Vietnam and they felt forgiven by the Vietnamese people, which is a heavy-duty thing, because after what we did to that country, if you think about it, the landmines and the Agent Orange defoliation of a country that thrives on agriculture, we completely eradicated their agriculture, And we planted, thousands of tons of landmines, so there's still a problem with that. So a lot of Vietnam veterans that are with swords and started with swords also sort of dedicated their lives, and I think a lot of it was driven from that pain that, I gotta, what was I part of? I gotta do something about this. So, I mean, there's all kinds of really wonderful projects where Vietnam veterans have gotten together, the Restoration Project, and not just Vietnam veterans, other veterans, and saw the similarities of their brothers and sisters who were former, enemies, and joining together and just recognizing that. So I really could go on and on here, but I do think that forgiveness is a very profound issue, and for us, it's an important part of the healing, because it all comes down to healing. The veteran will come in there, and there's issues around homelessness or poverty. They're trying to get their claim. They're trying to get them a job. It's really around empowering them, because they're in such a state of stress and depression and lack of energy. You want to sort of reverse that, and sometimes forgiveness is a big part of that. So I'm all for that. I think that's really great. So again, I'm just really proud to be honored like this, and of course Swords of Plowshares, which I think we've been fighting a good fight now for a lot of years, and we're where the community is. We're not afraid of fellow veterans who are poor and destitute and harmful, because one thing about poverty is it's a scary thing, not a pretty picture. people in great need is not a pretty picture. And we have lots of those folks around. So